In 1991, two English painters walked into a wheat field with a wooden plank and a length of rope. They pressed the board onto the crop and made a clean circle. Then they called a man who had spent years studying circles and saying that ordinary people could not make them. He walked into the field. He looked at the wheat. He studied the neat lines of the flattened stalks. He said it was genuine. The painters told him it was theirs. That should have ended the mystery. Instead, it made the story larger. A banana farmer had already described a saucer rising from a lagoon. A pilot later said a huge spiral appeared beside Stonehenge in less than an hour, in daylight. Farmers had lost crops. Tourists had paid to see the results. Experts had built careers around them. So how did a board and a rope become part of a worldwide mystery? To answer that, we have to go back before anyone used the words flying saucer. We have to go back to a field of oats, a bad bargain, and a story about the devil. In 1678, a small pamphlet appeared in Hertfordshire, England. Its title was The Mowing Devil, or Strange News Out of Hertfordshire. The story begins with a farmer who did not want to pay a mower's price. The farmer argued over the cost of cutting 3.5 acres of oats. Finally, he said he would rather the devil mow the field than pay that much money. That night, according to the pamphlet, the field seemed to glow. In the morning, the oats had been cut into neat, round shapes. The work looked too tidy to have been done by a person in one night. The farmer was afraid to carry the crop away. The picture printed with the story shows a little devil holding a scythe and walking in circles. For modern crop circle fans, this is often presented as the first example. But there is an important difference. The pamphlet says the oats were cut. Modern circles are usually made by bending stalks, not cutting them. The image was also part of a moral story. It was meant to show that the devil was real and that a bad bargain could bring trouble. It is not a photograph from the sky. It is not proof of an ancient UFO visit. But it does show something important. Long before aliens entered the conversation, people already understood that a strange, round mark in a crop could carry a powerful story. The shape was simple. The explanation could be whatever a community needed it to be. More than 200 years later, another person would describe a round patch in a field. This time, the explanation would begin with the weather. On July 21st, 1880, John Rand Capron walked through a neighbor's wheat field near Guildford. Capron was a solicitor and an amateur scientist. A violent storm had passed through the area, but the whole field had not been flattened. Instead, the crop had fallen in separate patches. From far away, those patches looked like circular spots. Up close, Capron noticed a pattern. A few stalks were still standing in the middle. Around them, the fallen stalks pointed in a ring, with their heads turned the same way. Beyond the circle was a sharp edge where the wheat was still upright. The field stood on sandy soil. The stems were strong. Capron could not simply blame weak plants. He made a sketch and sent a letter to the journal Nature. The letter was published on the 29th of July. Capron did not mention a saucer. He did not mention a spirit. He described a storm and wondered whether a spinning wind had pressed the wheat down in a circular motion. He also asked whether other readers had seen the same thing. That letter matters because it gives us a documented example of a crop circle-like shape before the modern UFO era. It also gives us a useful warning. A shape can be real while the story attached to it is wrong. The wheat really was down. The cause was still a question. In the 1880s, a notebook and a weather report were enough. In the next century, the same visual pattern would be read as evidence that a machine had landed. On January 19, 1966, George Pedley was driving a tractor near Yaramo, south of Tully in Queensland, Australia. He was about 27 and worked as a banana farmer. While he was driving, he heard a loud hiss above the tractor engine. His first thought was ordinary. A tire must have burst. He stopped and checked. The tire was fine. Pedley then saw what he described as a saucer-shaped craft rising from Horseshoe Lagoon. He estimated that it climbed about 30 or 40 feet before shooting away in a cloud of vapor. He went to the lagoon to see what had happened. Floating in the water was a round patch of reeds, about 30 feet across. The plants had been pressed down in a swirl, making what looked like a nest. Police and local officials came to look. No craft was found. Some people suggested a whirlwind or a waterspout over the lagoon. Pedley did not change his account. He had heard the hiss, he said, and he had watched something leave the water. Newspapers carried the story. Other flattened nests were reported near the same lagoon in the days that followed. Tully became a place people could point to when they wanted a physical landing site, not just a light in the distance. The Tully story is difficult because it contains two things at once: a clear witness and a possible weather explanation. The circle in the reeds was real. The meaning of the circle was not settled. The photograph-like image of a nest in a swamp traveled far beyond Queensland. It reached England, where people were already watching the sky. One of them was Doug Bower. Years later, he would say that the Tully story gave him the idea for a practical joke. By the mid-1960s, the English town of Warminster, in Wiltshire, had become famous for reports of strange things in the sky. People talked about lights, noises, and objects that seemed to move in ways aircraft should not. The local journalist Arthur Shuttlewood wrote about these reports and organized sky watches on Cradle Hill and Clay Hill. On cold nights, people stood outside with coats and flasks, waiting for the sky to do something. Some watchers also talked about round nests in the grass, as if a craft had touched down and left a seat behind. Warminster did not prove that anything unusual was visiting, but it changed the way people looked at the landscape. A hill was no longer just a hill. A field was a possible landing place. Every unusual light or flattened patch could be added to the same story. During the late 1970s and 1980s, simple circles began appearing overnight in fields across southern England. Wiltshire, Hampshire, and nearby counties produced more reports. The phrase crop circle became common in the early 1980s. The circles were usually found in standing wheat or barley. Farmers saw lost crops and strangers walking through their fields. Visitors saw signs. Newspapers saw dramatic photographs. Researchers argued about causes. Terence Meaden, a physicist, proposed that spinning air and electrical effects could create some formations. Other researchers believed the designs showed intelligence. The arguments grew because the circles were not only marks on the ground, they were marks in a place already prepared for mystery. Warminster had taught a whole region to look upward. Now the ground seemed to answer back. And somewhere in that same landscape, two painters were deciding to make the answer themselves. Doug Bower had lived in Australia, and he knew the story of the Tully nest. Around the mid-1970s, he says, he told his friend Dave Chorley that they should make it look as if a flying saucer had landed in an English field. Their tools were ordinary. A wooden plank flattened the crop. A rope helped them measure a circle. A wire loop attached to a cap helped Doug keep a straight line. They tried to walk in existing tractor tracks so their footprints would be harder to see. At first, the designs were simple. That was enough. A clean circle found in the morning could start an argument before breakfast. Over the years, the patterns became more complex. As newspapers and researchers became interested, the field became a stage. A larger or stranger design made a better photograph. The exact year Doug and Dave began is disputed in different accounts, but their method was consistent. Measure carefully, flatten the plants, and leave as little sign as possible. In September 1991, they decided to confess. The newspaper Today put them on its front page with a headline about the men who had fooled the world. The paper asked them to make a circle in Kent in front of reporters. They did it. Then the newspaper called Pat Delgado, a retired engineer and one of the best-known crop circle researchers. Delgado had written books with Colin Andrews. He believed that at least the genuine formations came from a higher intelligence. Delgado walked into the demonstration circle. He studied the flattened wheat and said that no ordinary human being could have made it. Then Doug and Dave told him that they had. The moment was funny, but it was also painful. A man who wanted evidence had been standing inside a confession and still saw a mystery. The event showed how powerful expectations can be. Once a circle is treated as a message, every detail seems to support the message. Doug and Dave claimed responsibility for hundreds of circles, not for every formation ever reported. Their confession solved one part of the story. A small group could make convincing circles with simple tools. It did not prove that every circle had the same maker. That gap kept the mystery alive, and 5 years later, a new pattern would make the gap look much larger. On Sunday, July 7th, 1996, a huge formation appeared in a wheat field near Stonehenge. The field sat beside the busy A303 road, close to one of the most photographed prehistoric sites in Britain. The design was a long spiral made from many circles. It was often counted as 151 circles, although descriptions vary. Because the shape reminded people of a repeating mathematical pattern, it became known as the Julia Set. The story became famous because of a pilot. On one pass, he said, the field looked normal. When he returned less than an hour later, the pattern was there. It was still daylight. Cars were moving on the road. Stonehenge was nearby. If the timing was accurate, a team using boards would have had very little time and almost no privacy. That is why the Julia Set became more than a beautiful design. It became a test of the human explanation. Nobody serious argues that wind created 151 planned circles in a spiral. The real question is whether people could have made it quickly enough. Human teams have shown that large formations can be built in a single night. They have used survey lines, ropes, and careful measurements to make work that looks impossible from the ground. But the daylight timing is different. It is based on a witness account, not on a camera watching the field from one moment to the next. Skeptical investigators have questioned the pilot's memory and the exact order of events. Supporters say the timing is still hard to dismiss. So the careful answer is this. The Julia Set is a real formation in a real field. Its design is human possible. The famous claim that it appeared in less than an hour, in daylight, has not been demonstrated on film and has not been completely settled. The pattern moved the debate away from nests and simple circles. Now the field looked like a canvas. The next question was no longer only, who landed here? It was, who is holding the brush? After the 1991 confession, the fields did not go quiet. In some ways, the confession gave people a manual. New teams learned to use boards, ropes, survey lines, and tractor tracks. Some worked for the fun of it. Some wanted attention. Some treated the work as a kind of land art. Farmers still paid the cost when people entered their fields without permission, but the formations attracted photographers, visitors, and a growing tourism business. In 2001, a formation at Milk Hill in Wiltshire contained about 409 circles arranged in a large, six-armed spiral. From the air, it looked like a perfect stamp pressed into the crop. On the ground, it was too large to understand in one view. You could walk through it and still not see the whole design. Milk Hill is often treated as a high point of the human craft. It was not a little nest in reeds. It was a planned image made for an audience in the sky. That change explains why the confession did not settle everything. Doug and Dave showed that humans could make the basic form. Later teams showed that humans could make something far more ambitious. The art became better than the original prank, and better art creates stronger arguments about authorship. By this point, saying that Doug and Dave made every circle was too simple. Saying that no human could make the beautiful ones was also too simple. The record now included named makers, named dates, and visible tools. It also included people who still believed that a few formations were different. Once humans can do the impressive part, the remaining mystery has to be narrower. It has to rest on a detail that a board and a rope cannot explain. Supporters of an unusual explanation often point to the plants. They describe stalks that look bent rather than broken. They point to swollen nodes, as if the plant was stretched by a short burst of heat. Some reports mention strange compass readings inside a formation. Those observations deserve to be checked, but they are not automatically proof of a spacecraft. A board can bend a stalk. Weather can damage plant tissue. A compass can react to metal, magnets, or a reading taken too close to a phone or vehicle. A test is only useful if it can tell a human-made circle from a different kind of event. The strongest explanation, based on the evidence we can repeat, is human. Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley demonstrated the simple circle. Later teams demonstrated large and complex designs. The Tully nest still has a witness account on one side and a possible weather event on the other. The Julia Set still has a famous daylight story whose timing has not been proven with a reliable clock. That leaves two honest possibilities, both limited. A few formations may contain plant changes that are not yet fully explained. Or the Stonehenge formation may really have appeared as quickly as the pilot remembered. Neither point has been proved. We do not need to invent a third answer just because the first two are uncomfortable. The shape of a circle stayed almost the same for centuries. The story around it changed. In 1678, it was a warning about the devil. In 1880, it was a weather problem. In 1966, it became a landing nest. In the 1970s, it became a joke. By 2001, it was a giant piece of art. That is why crop circles are still interesting. They tell us less about what may be visiting Earth than about how quickly people build meaning around a pattern. A mark appears first. The explanation arrives after it. The mystery of crop circles is not only about aliens. It is about how one flattened patch of plants can become a warning, a weather report, a miracle, a prank, or a work of art. The board explains much of the story. The witness accounts explain why the story never fully disappears. Until every disputed detail is recorded and tested, the field will keep offering both answers. So when you see a circle, ask two questions. Who made the mark, and who made the meaning?